Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Today's episode, another installment of Rapid Fire Q&A. So, let's kick it. First question, what is the difference between seated overhead press and seated behind the neck overhead press? Which one will be better for deltoids hypertrophy?
So, I mean, they both will be good for deltoid hypertrophy, but a few months ago, Porrick and I read this new research that came out. I'm forgetting exactly the year, but it's definitely in the last 3-4 years. And they looked at the different overhead press exercises and their recruitment on the delt. And it does seem like on a purely delt, especially the medial delt, the seated behind the neck press seems to be the winner in terms of recruitment. So if you're really looking to optimize medial delt recruitment with a pressing movement, seated behind the neck press would be the winner. But that being said, all variations have their merits.
Yeah, and then like all our other pressing movements are going to have a lot of anterior delt in it anyway. So no matter what, if we're doing your flat, your incline, your dip, you're still going to be hitting the anterior delt. So going one step further and then I'm blanking on the name, and trying to specialize in the medial delt with your overhead pressing variation with the behind the neck could be a good choice of change of stimulus. But most people do struggle with having enough external rotation to do that exercise in a safe manner. So if you don't have enough external rotation and shoulder mobility, you're just going to be grinding that joint. It's a very, very demanding mobility position to be in. And then lots of people actually cut the range short. So you'll see them doing the seated behind the neck press, but instead of the bar returning to the top of their traps on each rep, you'll see them cut it short, like
behind the head, not behind the neck.
Yeah, they really do. Once they pass the crown of the head, they'll start pressing again. So, to really get the most out of it, you should be coming the whole way back down each and every rep.
And they'll compensate with their wrist, or they'll lean their head forward, so it becomes very sloppy.
Yeah, it's a great exercise, but people really do butcher it a lot and use it at times that other people aren't really qualified for that lift.
Yeah, because I don't feel like you guys choose that exercise for that hypertrophy reason. So what for you are you choosing the seated behind the neck for people in programming?
Well, you definitely can choose it for the hypertrophy reason, but generally, personally, I normally look at it as a strength outcome as much as anything. So if I'm going to do it, it's for a specific reason. So a good example is if someone has a sticking point for their overhead press, which is roughly at their forehead level. At this point, you'll see strengthening the medial deltoids will have a really, really positive strength carryover to breaking through that sticking point. So if someone constantly has a technical breakdown there, if you program the behind the neck press, will be one really good way to blast through that sticking point. But it's also an exercise that we don't want to throw straight into low reps, high intensity, because it is so demanding on mobility, so demanding on the shoulder joint that you probably want to introduce it first in the accumulation phases so the trainee can get more used to that position with lighter loads.
Yeah, so to first introduce the behind the neck in a accumulation is definitely a good practice, because if you're not used to strain in such an externally rotated position, I mean, it's much safer to start with lighter weight, which fits the accumulation phase. Now, let's say that you really want to drive your behind the neck press. Well, one option you could use is using a fixed block structure where the first meso you're doing behind the neck at a lower intensity because you're in the accumulation phase. But the second meso, you maintain the behind the neck press, but now at a higher intensity through the intensification phase. So at least you can have this natural progression from light to heavy in a movement you're not used to. Another way I like to use the behind the neck is through hypertrophy specialization macros, where I would use, let's say, a tri-set or a giant set for the shoulders. I feel that at that point, you have pre-fatigue. So now it's even less load in that stressful position. But it's cool because it does allow you to have a slightly different motor unit recruitment pattern with your pressing movement than what you're used to with regular strength training. And whenever you can have a wide range of motor units being stimulated through training for the purpose of hypertrophy, it's always really good because the more fibers you can recruit and train, well, the higher your hypertrophy potential is because you're working more myofibrils. So in that sense, to use the behind the neck in the hypertrophy specialization makes it for a more effective training outcome in terms of hypertrophy.
Yeah. And another really good thing about using the fixed block, like Steph said, since it's not an exercise we use a ton, sometimes like find the appropriate loading, it's pretty difficult. So having 6 training sessions in a row, so 6 exposures in a row, really allows you to dial that in, because week 1 you're probably not going to get it. Realistically, if you get yourself within a rep or two that you know, all right, week 2 I can nail it, so week 2, week 3 you nail it. In week 4 you're changing your variables, so you're now going to move to higher intensity, lower reps. So it's going to take you that first week to really dial it in again. So it's just going to allow you to have way more consistency and way more specificity with your loading if you do it for that fixed block, if you're not used to doing that exercise.
And
go on. How much weaker are you in the behind the neck versus the...
Technically, it should be about 6%, but realistically, most people are much weaker, but it's mostly because they don't train it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, they don't have the range.
But when I started training like 25, 30 years ago, it was like taboo. It was like something that they always told you not to do because it was dangerous and stuff. And I wish I had more, I had more range of motion back then. So if you have someone who's just starting off or a younger athlete, I think people need to start introducing it while they're young and they have that mobility and they can maintain that as they progress.
Yeah, I mean, we still have like an old friend in Montreal that, what is he, like your age, maybe a little older?
You called him an old friend? Oh, like an old friend.
Yeah.
Not
You
like
had him
an
for a long
old
time.
Jeez, like
I'm sensitive.
the whole age stuff really affects you. But he must be like 51 or 52. But he used to be a gymnast when he was younger, and that guy still to this day does proper behind the neck pull-ups. That to me is impressive. Like if you think a behind the neck press is hard, well, try a behind the neck pull-up.
Yeah,
that dude can do it like proper.
Mm-hmm.
Behind the neck lat pull down has seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth because it used to be a big thing.
Yeah,
but that's again, anything behind the neck, they just basically said like it's dangerous, you shouldn't do it. But the reason is like, I mean, we should be able to do full range of everything. So we just lose
look at
that ability.
Look at weightlifters.
Yeah.
Of course. But like to go back again to the timing of the behind the neck, another approach that's interesting. Like Porik was talking earlier about like sticking points. So if you let's say you're doing a overhead press macro cycle where like the goal is to drive your standing overhead press as much as possible. So of course, like if you base it off of the optimizing strength ratio course, like you want to train the standing overhead press in the intensification phase when the intensity required is much higher. So you're rehearsing that movement where it counts in the intensification. But now the accumulation phase, your overhead press variation that you choose could be the behind the neck for both accumulation. So that would be a good way to repeat the movement within a macro, repeat it at a lower average intensity so you get used to the movement, but at the same time, you're helping the outcome of improving your behind the neck press by working at an angle that will stimulate the musculature in a way that would help you break that sticking point on your press. So like the behind the neck press is really cool. There's many different ways to do it, but I think like the general message to get from this is if you've never done it, make sure you first introduce it in accumulation so that the average load is less.
Yeah. And just always make sure that the client
Can get
has that positioning. So I'm deducting from my own training and just thinking, because I've recently had a lot of the seated behind the neck in my programming. And to me, one exercise, even though it's not the same because it doesn't have that behind the neck, that I feel helped me prepare for that in terms of like stabilization from my core for it is the Z press. Does that make any sense?
Not really, but
Yes, but
it's that you're going from a Z press that you have zero support to a behind the neck press that is still an unsupported overhead press variation and you're while seated. So like I can understand why you feel like you have better ability to brace your core, but it won't change anything in terms of the mobility aspects.
yeah, but I already have that, so that wasn't
yes.
that. Like to me, it's definitely you still need to really stabilize the core during the behind the neck.
But the only reason why you're saying this though is because we tend to program the behind the neck unsupported.
Yeah,
but a lot of people, like a lot of trainers, would prescribe the behind the neck with a back supported.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
It's just the way we do it.
I was just thinking unsupported in my head the whole time.
And then when we're doing seated overhead press, it's normal enough for us to use like a 75-degree bench. If you're doing a seated behind the neck press, you really want to make sure that bench is fully jacked up, because if you're leaning back slightly, it's going to really you're never going to get that bottom range of motion. So why
do you guys mostly do unsupported?
This is just not experience, but like we learned it that way, like when we were really young. So we just kept doing it that way. But it's not necessarily like a standard or a mistake to do it back supported. The only thing is back supported. Make sure that you use an actual like pressing seat.
Yeah. Because it's going to get in the
because
way.
if you use a regular bench and the back seat goes above your head, you won't. It's going to be really awkward to get the barbell behind your back.
Yeah.
So like our seated press bench, the back seat is not too high, so it doesn't affect it.
Yeah. Like the only time I've ever actually done a back supported behind the neck press is on one of the like a seated bench with the breakaway bars. Like so, it's actually designed for overhead press. But like, how many times do you come across those? Like, it's not a very regular thing. So I think learning the unsupported variation is probably going to be more beneficial for most people. I think it's just way more applicable.
But it's just because like we learned this from Charles Poliquin, and the reason why he liked it unsupported was to help as much as he could the exercise carry over to the standing overhead press. So the standing, you need to be able to support your trunk in space. Now you're seated, it's a little bit more stable, but it's okay to be more stable in an accumulation phase anyways, because you have more rep, longer time under tension, and on and on and on. But that's why.
In his test, the structural balance, it was behind the neck, right?
Yes, he does. Yeah. Charles had no numbers for standing overhead press. He had numbers for the unsupported behind the neck and the standing one arm dumbbell press.
Okay, moving on. Next question. I'm going to read the start of this one because it's cute. Hello, everyone. I'm a big fan of Kilo Strength Society. Thank you for opening this question box. You're welcome. I wonder about the stage system ascending. I know this rep scheme should be used more for an advanced lifter, but for example, 5-5-7-7-9-9, I put it in accumulation, so should I pick the estimated 5 RM to start or estimated 7 RM, then less than 5% to start the first set?
So first of all, it's perfect. It's great that he's using this for the accumulation phase, because the stage ascending should be done in accumulation. Like, it's more effective because the last signals you're sending to your brain are a signal of volume and not intensity. So it makes sense for that purpose. But to answer the question, the best way to load is the ladder. So when he's saying that you start week 1 5% less than the actual RM. So, for example, if a lifter's 1 rep max is 100 kilos, 5 reps is 85%. So it means that this athlete's 5 RM is 85 kilos. Now, you could start at 85 kilos session 1, but it would be extremely brutal. Not many people will have the capacity and recovery ability to be able to do 6 sets at true RM for 3 weeks in a row, or 3 sessions in a row. So because of this, you're better off with the majority of people creating a buffer, typically a 5% buffer in intensity for week 1. So to redirect to his question, so he's saying, or should you start week 1 or session 1 with your 7 RM? Yes, because 7 RM is 80%. So 7 RM is 5% less than the 5 RM. So your actual 7 RM is the weight you should start with on week 1. But now, what's interesting is before you start that macro cycle, before you do that first mesocycle, you have a new estimated 1 RM. Let's say you're doing the overhead press. So your new estimated 1 RM is 100. So now you're doing 5, 5, 7, 7, 9, 9. So start session 1 with your 7 RM, which is 80. Okay, so now you're doing 80, 80 for 5, 5. Then you go to 85, 85 for 7, 7. I'm sorry. You go to 75 and 75 for 7, 7. And then 5% less, 70 and 70 for 9 and 9. Perfect. So that's week 1. But the thing is, even though you're less than your actual RM, you will still have a training response. Okay. For 1, you have enough volume to elicit a strength training response. 5% is a decent buffer. It's not overdoing it. And second of all, you're re-familiarizing yourself with an exercise you hadn't done in at least 3 weeks. So there's a learning effect. There's an intermuscular coordination learning effect. So no matter what, you're gaining a strength training response from that. So by session 2, now you go to your actual RM values that you've established before you started the macro. So now your 5 is 85. Your second 5 is 85. Then 80 for 7, 80 for 7, 75 for 9, 75 for 9. So now session 2 is technically at your pre-macro cycle determined RM values. But because of the learning effect and the strength gain from session 1, although you're using your RM for session 2, it's still doable. It's not taxing. You almost need to look at it as now you have a 2.5% buffer. Okay. So now the thing is, by week 3, now you push the envelope, you're pushing the limit. Now you go up 5%. You go 5% above your actual RM value of your pre-mesocycle numbers. So now you're at 90%, you're at 90 kilos, 90 kilos, 85 kilos, 85 kilos, 80 kilos, 80 kilos. So week 3 is truly challenging. Week 3 with these complex rep scheme is where it will be a fight, it will be a battle, and you might miss a rep or 2. That's fine. But this is how most people should load complex rep scheme if you want to reap the benefits of it and not basically die by week 2.
Yeah. But it's also why complex rep schemes are so brutal, so challenging on your recovery, because that last week, like 6 reps at true RM loads is brutal. Like, so it's why we're very sparing with how much we actually use them in reality. Like, we talk about complex rep schemes a lot. We have databases explaining them, when to use them. But realistically, it's, if we're choosing to use them, 1, maybe 2 per macro cycle. If someone's really advanced to get 2, like, I know you can go more than that, but in totality and in averages of how we do training. It's not. Like, if someone's averaging at 2 complex rep schemes per macro, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That is a lot. So,
But a lot of people do that wrong, right? They almost do the step loading. So even if in the case of the 5.5, 7.799, they'll do like 80.
Yeah.
Like
82.
and then 82 and then 85. So then they're not doing the true
Yeah,
rep scheme.
it's not.
It's not.
It's not like it's not. You're not going to gain a strength response,
Yeah.
but it's not the purpose of those rep schemes. That's just not what it was meant to be. It was meant to be a more of a base off of the law of repeated effort. So submitting the brain to the exact same load and motor pattern and reps for 2 successive sets. So you're basically registering that motor unit recruitment pattern. So you're actually maintaining or building the true long-lasting strength.
So if they can't do it, then they shouldn't be doing that rep scheme. Basically, they need to choose something.
I mean,
else.
but that's the problem, right? Because a lot of novice trainees could do it, but it's just that it's easy to do if you don't know your RM values and you start session 1 with what you think is a 5% buffer, but in reality is a 15% buffer. Yeah. So you never get there. Yeah. So, it seems like, it's no big deal. It's like people doing waves.
Yeah.
Like people, they do waves, but they undershoot so much that they do 3 or 4 waves, but they never truly got a true post-activation potentiation. So their sets are arranged in a wave-like fashion, but the training effect of wave never happens. It's just like they're doing multiple sets.
Yeah. Because waves are hard. Waves are really hard to load because it's really easy to undershoot and not get a potentiation. It's really easy to overshoot and just create fatigue. Like before you implement waves, you should really know your loads, know your recoverability, because it's a very, very tricky thing to get right, and most people don't.
And like we teach in the online periodization course, wave is one of the last rep scheme you should introduce to clients. But to go back to what Porrick was saying, like for my average client, and my average client is probably more like intermediate.
Yeah.
We're talking about maybe between 2 to 4 complex rep schemes per year.
Yeah,
that I use. Honestly,
yeah.
I use standard reps for the majority of the time because it's easier to learn your lift.
Yeah,
and it's easier to manage fatigue because we're using step loading every time.
Next question. Why is the dumbbell lunge usually programmed in the lower body sessions of the intensification phases? Can split squat variations fit in the B series and intensification phases as well?
Yeah, this statement is a misinterpretation because it's not true that the lunge is usually prescribed in the intensification, but I know where he's coming from with that question.
Yeah.
I'm saying he because I know exactly who it is. But for example, so you're novice, you're starting to train. Well, you should start with split squats because you need to be able to learn to lunge in a more stable environment, which is what the split squats provide, right? Both feet are in contact with a surface the entirety of the set, so you're in control. So you're learning to lunge properly. So if that's the case, then your entire first 12-week macro could be all split squat variations. It could even be the exact same split squat exercise the entire time, depending on the rate of progress of the client. So it could be accumulation, intensification, it doesn't matter. Now, why he's saying this is simply because once you get to a point where you're very proficient at split squat and you're proficient at lunges, at that point in time, you can switch it up and go back and forth between both. So if that's the case, then it makes sense on the exercise selection perspective to use a more stable exercise in the accumulation phase when the time under tension is much longer, and then choose the lunge, which is more dynamic in nature, in an intensification phase where the phase calls for more intensity. The lunge is by default more intense because you have more force upon landing as you're absorbing the load from your step on the ground, and the movement is more dynamic, so there's more force production during the concentric action. So everything about the lunge makes sense for an intensification. But you only do this in the context of being both and good in both. Because if your split squat looks really bad, well, there's no way your lunge is going to be good. So if that's the case, you need to stick to split squat until the split squat is really good.
Yeah, and then both of them only play, like we did this full episode on our love-hate relationship with split squats. They're only applicable for so long. So once we get to the point that our split squat's strong as hell, our lunge is strong as hell, both of them can disappear. Like we don't, just because the B1 exercise of a lower body one day or lower body 2 days says bottom range knee extension, doesn't mean it has to be a lunge or a split squat. We can bring in a triple jump or step up. We could bring in another squatting variation. Like there is other options that we can use there. We can change the train split entirely, which I know might shock some people, but but because they might be beyond the point that they need more bottom range strength in knee extension. The squat alone might be enough fatigue throughout the week that they can't handle any more bottom range knee extension. So their B series might be a top range knee extension.
That's a good point Paul brings up, because I think this is lost in strength training talks. Like unilateral movements are great, and I firmly believe in them, and you need them. But ultimately, in a perfect world, my goal is to take a client or an athlete to the point where they can get away with just doing bilateral work.
Yeah.
Because bilateral work, at the end of the day, you're always going to be able to produce more output, more force, more output, more metabolic disturbance. There's so much more that you can get out of this. But of course, if you have huge left to right discrepancies, if you have huge mobility issues, well, then you need to maintain unilateral movement. But there comes a point in time where, hey, you should. It's okay if we do a phase or two with just bilateral movements. That's fine. You just need to earn it.
Yeah.
And that's basically where you're at now.
Yeah, like yes, my lower body one session yesterday was squat, standing good morning, calves, abs, done. That was it. Simple.
Because once you get to the point where these unilateral movements become more like fluff, well, then you might as well spend more time on the big movers, which are these big multi-joint bilateral movements. Okay, like if you don't have any discrepancies and now you can do 10 sets of 6 of squats, well, you're at a good place.
Yeah, and you're going to get way more overarching benefits from your 10 sets of 6 of squats than doing 4 sets of squats, 3 sets of split squats, 2 sets of, or another 3 sets of
extension,
like a step up, when you've already got good balance between legs. You've got your dynamic mobility.
You did the work.
You've done the work. You've got stability. Like you've got all that. So why not just double down on the biggest bang for your buck? And then you can't afford to add more and more exercises because the fatigue level generated during those 10 sets of 6. So it's you just have to pick and choose what's the most appropriate thing.
People just do need to remember that not all your clients are going to get there.
Oh, most of them aren't.
Yeah, most of them aren't. So we're not saying that the goal is always to get to what Porrick is doing. Like, most of your clients are still going to need a lot of.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, I just want to make sure that people don't take this and be like, Steph said, blah, blah.
Exactly.
I'm just saying that there's a point in time where you can do a few phases of just bilateral and it's fine. I'm not saying that once you get there, never do bilateral. That would be a huge mistake because at one point, you need to throw back in these movements just on the deloading perspective anyways.
100%, because that's another thing that I have to really take into consideration with training is what is my recoverability going to be just on a loading perspective. So if I'm only doing big compound movements, every session, every workout, I'm just going to get beat up. So sometimes you just add in unilateral movements and might even choose more, like choose variations or choose loadings that
challenge it even more.
It favor lighter loads. Yeah. So like it could be like I'm doing a single leg squat and it's contralateral dumbbell or ipsilateral dumbbell just so I can't use as much weight, so it allows for more recovery. Just because at some point, if you're doing a lot of sets on the big compound movements, you just need to back off. Yeah.
Too strong for it.
That's not the issue. My recovery is just not good enough.
Okay, next question. During the overhead press, I have some clients that have their elbows turn out at about 50 to 75%. Is this bad? If so, how do you recommend I improve this?
It's not bad, but it does say something. And usually it means that if you were to test their external rotators of the shoulders, they probably lack shoulder external rotation. So it might be something you want to address as a standalone, and then you'll notice a correction of that issue.
I mean, they should if it's turned out that much, I would probably really work on external rotation mobility before doing any type of overhead pressing. Like eventually, if you don't address it, it's going to be a problem.
Or just stick with dumbbell variations because you can't get away with as much. Because if once your elbow's outside your wrist in a dumbbell, the dumbbell stops going up.
Yeah, that's true.
When do you think it would be best to incorporate FRC PAILS and rails into a workout? Pre-workout, at the end of a workout, between sets for opposing muscle groups?
People aren't going to like this answer because the real answer is in a separate session. FRC is super demanding when done properly and is far better off trained in a separate session.
I think people sometimes with FRC, based on like conversations we've had, they think of it almost just as like a stretch or a warm-up versus actually being its own training modality to get the results of actually improving like range of motion on a long term.
I think it's like almost like two things. Like the PAILS and rails, if you're doing it like straight up like the PAILS and rails, for sure do it in a separate session. If you're training someone, we'll do it at the end of the session. You do your weight training first. But you can do like the PNF, which kind of resembles the PAILS and rails, but it's a far less like intensity. So you can do that to gain like instant range of motion before the session, but just know that there's a difference between the PNF stretching and the full blown like PAILS and rails. Yeah.
Because along with what Alex is saying, so first of all, FRC is not just PAILS and rails. Yeah. You also have cars, right? So the cars can definitely be done as a warm-up. Mm-hmm. Okay, we do that. Yep. We do hip and shoulder cars as a warm-up before upper lower body sessions. That's fine. But the PAILS and rails, like they have 3 different levels of intensity. And the lowest level of intensity, that's the one you introduce where you radiate like up to 30-ish% or whatever. Well, this resembles a lot more PNF, okay? So where you're basically contracting the agonist just enough to relax the antagonist to get momentary range of motion. But this just does that. It just gives you momentary range of motion. The true PAILS and rails is once you get to level 2 and level 3, especially. I know that Andrew Spina talks about, because it's very, what's cool with their system, and it's very in line with strength training information, where in strength training, we know that the minimum threshold to gain strength is 70%. So that's kind of what they recommend with their PAILS and rails, like a minimum of 70% of irradiation, and then you build up to 100%. But it's only once you get close to that 100%, just like in strength training, that you get most of the benefits. But if you're doing this in between sets of squats or lunges or split squats or leg curls, it's too brutal. Like you're going to negatively affect your strength training movements, and the strength training movement intensity will negatively affect your ability to push the PAILS and rails. So in my opinion, you're missing.
Yeah. And even if you were to do like the upper body, that's if you're doing squats and then you decide to do PAILS and rails on an upper body or shoulder, it would take too long. Like your rest period would be too long.
But there's also a systemic fatigue though. Like if you're irradiating the arm at like 95% of your maximum capacity, you're still wiping your recovery ability for your set of squat after.
Because this person did end with saying, or do you think it's best to keep them away from workouts and done as a separate routine on their own?
Yeah,
and then they had, like, going back to what you just said, because they had example, couch stretch, PAIL between sets of barbell, RDL, or hamstring PAIL between sets of barbell, back squats, split squats.
I wouldn't do it within the training session.
But the PAIL is the PNF.
Mm-hmm.
So if
you're choosing between a PAIL or a rail.
Yeah, but because it's great to stretch the antagonist. Yeah. That's fine. Like, I mean, people have been doing this since the early 70s. But not full blast 100%. So that's why Alex keeps referring to PNF. It's just that PNF, we're talking about 20 to 30% intensity on a progressive angular loading. Yeah. So it's way more manageable, and you're doing on the antagonist. Like, I do this sometimes. Like, I made a post months ago.
Last time you were active on social media.
So like before September.
Before September 2024, where like I'm trying to get my heel to touch my butt on a standing leg curl. Like, I'm lacking a little bit of flexion range at top range. Well, in between my sets of standing leg curl, I would do PNF on my quad using like a version of a couch stretch. It works really well, but it's not demanding.
Yeah. That's the big thing, because you definitely don't want the overly demanding side of the FRC PAILS and rails, but a static stretch or a PNF sort of stretch on the antagonist muscle group, there's no issues with that. When it comes to like compound movements like squats and deadlifts, I would be hesitant because there's no true antagonist. Yeah. There's too much shit working at once. But for like RDLs and stuff, I think it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Leg curl. Like, leg curl is definitely the most traditional old school example I've seen. Like, it's been a long time that people are on a leg curl, they'll do a quad stretch in between sets.
I mean, it's so straight, it's a single joint. It's straightforward as hell.
It makes the most sense.
When you're saying, so we're in agreement that we're doing this as a separate session. So in your eyes, does that almost count as a second session? So is it like a version of doing 2-a-days in terms of like how it would affect your recoverability with training?
Yeah.
I don't think like it would affect I don't think it would affect your recoverability if you were to do like.
Well, there's going to be some recovery demand, but it's not going to be the same level of a demand as a second resistance training session.
Okay, because that opens a good topic of discussion, because there's recovery is twofold. You need to recover in a metabolic perspective. Yeah. And this, of course, FRC will be completely different on a metabolic perspective because FRC is mostly iso dominant. So you don't have the metabolic cost of concentric action. So on a metabolic recovery perspective, it's nowhere near as close to it. But on a neural and neurotransmitter recovery perspective, if you're really doing your FRC the way it's supposed to be the way like we did it with Andrew Spina in class and Hunter and Dewey. I mean, it's brutal. So like mentally you're wiped. So you still need to recover from that mental stress before you do another session. So that's why, to me, if you're doing strength in the morning, FRC in the PM 4 times a week, which is great, it will work, but make sure that you focus on proper recovery because you're going to need it. But of course, metabolically, FRC will never be near a lower body strength training session.
Yeah.
Next question. When programming for a GBC cycle, do you still use undulating periodization, or does that take away the point of GBC having an intensification phase?
Well, I would never do German body comp for an entire 12-week macro cycle. Like we don't teach that, we don't promote that, nor. I mean, Charles did it for his book, but it was more in a marketing perspective.
You'll do a lot of things to sell books.
Yeah, but that's not something you would necessarily do. And the other thing is it's really hard to do an intensification with a program like German Body Comp. So, I mean, if you were to do our fat loss specialization course online, you'll see that we use undulating periodization with these types of training methods, but we define accumulation and intensification very differently than in standard strength training, where standard strength training, intensification versus accumulation is a reflection of load as a matter of 1 RM. But with these type of metabolic training session, we distinguish accumulation and intensification based off of metabolic work, which is a reflection of total time under tension done per session. So there's a density perspective to the whole mix. So that's how we differentiate between accumulation and intensification. But the intensification, we don't use GBC. We'll use more like known bodybuilding techniques like trisets and stuff like that. To intensify the work. Yeah. But 12 weeks straight of GBC, it's not something we would recommend. You too quickly you'd get to a point of diminishing return. And of course, if you're dealing with the untrained Gen Pop, it doesn't matter as much. But at the same time, like we teach in that course, GBC is probably the worst training method you can do with that population. So in
it's
a way,
almost like if you're using that with that population and those people don't know how to train, you're kind of just taking them through like
you're just doing their whole body work. Yeah. It's not GBC.
Boot camp style.
Yeah, exactly.
Workout.
Yeah, but like the problem with GBC is for like programming, thinking about accumulation, intensification. So by default, each set of GBC you want to be 60 seconds. That is how the whole structure is based. So no matter if you're programming 20 reps, you're programming 10 reps, the time under tension for the full set is the same. So the load is going to be somewhat similar. So all you're doing is doing more reps with the same load as you differentiate the reps, and the only way you can differentiate the reps is altering the tempo to allow for more reps in the same amount of time. So it's not like we can actually influence the intensity, even though we're changing the amount of volume. The intensity is going to be roughly the same with the GBC, and it's going to be more based on your work capacity than your strength levels. Because
like people, too many people think like the whole clan, like in the last 7 years, that tries to debunk time under tension, and it says that time under tension is useless and on and on. Well, the one thing that they're disregarding is if you've never trained with controlled tempo, of course, you will see a drastic difference between a 5 RM at 2010. Well, 5 RM is not a good thing. Let's say a 10 RM at 2010 and a 10 RM at 4010. Because these people have no true concentric ability. Everything they do is based off of the stretch shortening cycle. But if you're someone who's trained, at least coming from our background, where your early days used more controlled tempo, like a 3 or 4 second eccentric, to slow down the rep so that your concentric action are a better reflection of a concentric action because you're taking away from that stretch shortening cycle, you'll notice that the difference in load, that the possible load you're able to use between a 10 RM at 2010 and a 10 RM at 4010 for these people is not that big of a difference. Okay? It's pretty much the same load. Now, what's going to differ is the time under tension. So on a load perspective, I'm doing 10 reps, I'm going to use 75 pounds, doesn't matter. But if I'm doing 10 reps in 30 seconds or 10 reps in 60 seconds, that's going to be a huge difference, not as much in the load, but a huge difference in the energy system being targeted during that workout. Although it's 10 reps for both, you'll produce way more lactate in a 60-second set than a 30-second set. It's the nature of being under tension for a longer period of time. So the training response on a hormonal or metabolic perspective won't be the same. So that's why with methods like German body composition, you cannot disregard the time under tension because the entire premise of the system is a reflection of how much lactate you can produce per set times per amount of sets within a training session. So the density component of each of these 60-second sets is what gives you the results from GBC. So if you're doing your 10 reps of GBC in 10 seconds, I'm sorry, but you're not really producing nowhere near the same amount of lactate as you do in 60 seconds, so you're not getting the same training response. But it's false to think, unless you have zero experience at slower controlled tempo, that you're going to have this huge drastic difference in load just because you're doing a more controlled tempo.
How does it feel getting that off your chest, Steph?
I mean, always feels good.
It's therapeutic.
Yeah, and then you see the people that have a huge differentiation, like they're so reliant on the stretch shorten cycle and the momentum generated from that bouncing out of the bottom. Like if you add, like, so say you're throwing a different variable and you then add a pause at the bottom of a rep, like they are screwed. So like depending what you're trying to achieve. If you just want to lift the biggest load humanly possible, okay, go fast. And there is definitely a time and place to go fast with your loading. Definitely, we recommend it all the time. But if you want to really push your concentric strength as far as possible, negating the elastic energy generated during the eccentric is a huge factor in developing that. And that can be done with slower eccentrics, it can be done with pauses. There's loads of ways that we can manipulate it. It can be done with static overcome by dynamic, so dead stop and inertia variations. But at some point you do have to address the concentric, not just creating more and more momentum based off bouncing out of the bottom.
Yeah, because like eventually you'll reach a plateau. So what do people do when they reach a plateau? Paused reps. Yeah. Well, guess why it works? Because it negates some of the stretch shortening cycle and it forces you to recruit more motor units at the start of the movement to move more weight. So you're improving concentric strength. Well, guess what kind of also does that as a base? Starting your training career with a more controlled eccentric tempo. And please don't think that 4010 is eccentric training. That is not eccentric training. This is just controlling the eccentric portion of the rep to have more eccentric control and take away some of the stretch shortening cycle to express your concentric better, and slowly building joint resiliency for higher load. So it's a normal, healthy, smart way to start your training journey. And once you've built that base and control and intermuscular coordination, you speed it up to now use the stretch shortening cycle. And then once you master that, then you know what? The best thing you can do to keep getting stronger, varying tempo.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, the people who do train like that
So you
are
want a
definitely,
mic drop.
are definitely more versatile, right? They can do the slow tempos, they can do the quick, but then someone, and we see it all the time when people we see for the first time and they're used to training in college and we ask them to do 4010 and it drastically decreases their 1RM score.
Yeah, I mean, I've told this story before, and I probably said it on the podcast, but I once assessed a college fullback that was my first time training him. He's never trained with me, just trained in college and high school, and he was always training fast, right? And I told him, okay, so what do you, because I always ask them, what do you think is your 1RM on bench? And he said like 400 something. And I knew that that was not possible because we did the test on a 40x0. Like his 1RM ended up being 275.
Yeah.
Drastic, huge. But at the same time, though, and I just want to say, because I'm not saying all this because we believe only in 4010. No way.
We've been working hard on trying to get people to understand that that's not what we believe.
But because the problem on the other end, I've trained people that have been doing 4010 the entire life. And then you ask them to go on a 2010, they're actually weaker because they're too scared. Like it's too fast for them. They don't have that control. Yeah. So that's at one point you need to move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The reason why people hear us talk about 4010 or 40x0 so much is it's what 90% of your clients need most of the time.
Yeah.
But once your clients get past the point of needing that, all right.
Or if you're training athletes.
Oh, yeah, definitely for athletes. Yeah.
We'll end it on that one. So we're now probably just a few weeks out from our May comprehensive periodization and comprehensive program design seminar here at Kilo. We are above 30 attendees already. We do want to bump that up a little bit more because I think it's going to be...
Fitty.
I think it's going to be a really cool experience for us to host such a large group here at Kilo, which we have not done. Actually, we've only ever hosted large groups outside when we travel because it's the only time we open up the numbers that much. We have strength coaches from colleges coming in. We have personal trainers from all over. I think it's going to be a really fun weekend, and all of you that aren't joining us will have some serious FOMO. So it's May 17th and 18th, the comprehensive.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's either 17th, 18th, or 16th, 17th.
Yeah.
That weekend.
Yeah.
No computers in front of us. It's one of those weekends. Trainkilo.com to secure your space. Thank you for submitting your questions. Keep them coming, and we will see you next week. Ew.